All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us in our first Regional Heritage Stewardship Program webinar of 2018 on caring for photographic collections. I just wanted to, before I'm going to turn everything over to Rachel in just a second, but I just wanted to give you an update heads up on we just hot off the presses scheduled our next webinar for this series. It's going to be on dealing with mold in cultural collections, and it'll be on February 27th and 28th for the two RHSP regions. I actually don't have it right now exactly which one is which, but it'll be either the 27th or 28th for Appalachia. And that'll be presented by Jillian Marcus, who is a conservator here working currently on a statewide initiative for the state of New York, but you will learn all about Jillian in February. Today, we're here to learn about caring for photographic collections with Rachel Wetzel, who is a photograph conservator here at the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts. You are welcome to type questions at any time in the chat box, but Rachel will not address them until the end of the presentation. So just, go ahead and type questions as you think of them, and I will pass them along to her when we have a few minutes at the end. There are a few handouts that you should be able to access. I thought they would appear in the upper left of your screen. I'll get back to figure that out, so you may be able to see some handouts appearing in the upper left of your screen in a moment that Rachel, I think, may refer to throughout her presentation. So you're welcome to download those now or later. And without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Rachel. So thanks, welcome.
Hello. I hope everybody can hear me okay. My name is Rachel Wetzel, and I'm here to talk a little bit about caring for your photographic collections. So today's webinar topics, we will cover the following. The first part will be giving you a little bit of introduction as to why photographs have special needs and are treated differently than other materials in your collection. The second part, we will talk a little bit about handling and labeling your photographs. And the third part, we will talk about choosing the storage materials that you will buy to house your photographic collections. And the last section, I'll talk a little bit about the role of temperature and the environment and the impact that has on photographic collections. And then after that, you can feel free to ask any of your pressing questions that I didn't cover. I just want to point out that there's going to be a lot of information in this webinar, and when we get the handout up for later, all of that information will be in there. So if you didn't get to take extremely rigorous notes, that's okay, because it'll all be laid out very nicely in the handout for you. So without further ado, let's start with the very first topic. So photographs, why do they have special needs? Well, I'm going to go a little bit into what causes a photograph to deteriorate, and as you can see from the list here, there's quite a number of ways that a photograph will deteriorate. So I'm just going to go over these a little bit. We all have heard about light damage with photographs. We've all had photographs on our walls that have had a lot of sunlight, and we've noticed that they've faded over time. So light is a huge damaging factor of photographic materials, but also your environment. So if it's too hot or it is too humid, so fluctuations in your temperature and relative humidity. If you keep your objects in the attic, you might see a lot of damage to your photographs, but also if you keep them in the basement and it's very humid, you also might see more damage to your photographs. Other things that contribute are the materials that come into direct contact with photographs. So this is what we're going to cover in the storage section later. So the materials that contain lignin or other tapes or adhesives, those materials can have adverse effects on photographs, as well as materials that are acidic. Also within your environment, you can have things like ozone, which comes out of photocopiers or occurs from other pollutants in the air. Things like sulfur, those things will all deteriorate the silver of the image. When you have a flood and you have prolonged water exposure, that can have some really negative damaging effects on photographs. And then sometimes you might do all the right things to store your photographs properly, but maybe the photographer themselves or the person who printed the photographs for that photographer wasn't incredibly diligent. So if there's residual processing chemistry or just, sort of negligence upon the part of the photographer himself, sometimes those are what we refer to as inherent vice and things that you really don't have a whole lot of control over. And then there are the things that we do to the photographs, such as, gluing them or taping them to different pages, putting staples and paper clips on them, if we handle them improperly, if we label them improperly, if we try to clean them ourselves. These are all the things that we call human intervention that will cause deterioration. So first I want to explain a little bit about the two different types of silver that you'll find in photographic collections, because it plays a role in how these things deteriorate or how stable they are for the long term. So the first type of silver, which is called colloidal silver, is the type of silver that was used in 19th century photographs. So these are all handmade photographs where the photographer would actually coat a silver emulsion onto a paper themselves. So the difference with those are when you coat this light sensitive silver salt onto a paper and then you put it in direct contact with a negative and stick it in the sun, you will literally see the object printing out. So this is the image on the left. And then when you get the image from enough sunlight to a relative density that you're happy with, then you take it into a room where you wash it and fix it to stabilize it. So that's one first way of making a silver print. And then the second way, which more people are familiar with, which is the 20th century method of making silver gelatin photographs or silver photographs, are developing out, which uses filamentary silver. So this is all developing out. Photography is mostly manufactured papers like Kodak, Agfa, Ilford. So there's a lot of science and precise measurement of the amount of silver that goes into the paper. It's very evenly displaced throughout the paper because it's machine made and it's not hand coated like the printing out papers. So what you get with that is a lot of dense silver that is contained in a light sensitive paper, but when you expose the paper under the enlarger, you don't actually see the image printing out like you did in the previous slide. So you get what we call a latent image, which is sort of a ghost image. And then once you put that piece of paper into the developing chemicals, that's when you start to see the image form. So the developer forms the image rather than the sunlight forming the image. So that's the difference. And what that will mean to you is that if you look at this slide here, there's two different types of image forming silver. So that colloidal silver from the 19th century, the printing out process, leaves you with a whole bunch of really tiny silver particles. So that's all the black dots on this slide here. I'll move the arrow. So all of these little bits are silver that forms the image. And then the 20th century developing out filamentary silver, this is the silver here. So you can see it's a lot larger than the 19th century silver, and it forms in massive clumps. And the difference in that is that the filamentary silver forms a true black, because you can really have a lot of mass of silver metal that forms the image, where with the colloidal silver, since it's so dispersed, the image tonality is a little more brownish orange, and then usually toned with gold or some other metal that will change the color and make it a little more purple. But the difference in these two sizes of silver is also plays a role in how they deteriorate. So if you imagine that large clump of filamentary silver, um, so if you imagine this is the large clump of filamentary silver, and then you have something, let's say like sulfur in the environment that starts to break down the silver. So it's going to take a long time to break down this into a teeny tiny particle, where when it breaks down into either colloidal silver, which I mentioned is what makes up the 19th century uh, photographic silver image, or it breaks down into silver sulfide. But you can imagine this already is the colloidal silver, so it doesn't take much to break down one of these particles versus breaking down this huge massive silver. So you're going to find in your collections that the things that you have that are from the 19th century are probably going to be more deteriorated than the things you have from the 20th century. And it's not necessarily because they're probably 100 years older. It really has to do with the size of the silver. So it's just to give you a visual example, here on the left is the colloidal silver image. Now this image looks a little bit more like it did when you first process it. I mentioned that the color is a little bit orangish brown, but they were generally toned with gold in this case, and that gold would make a really deep purple. You never get quite a true black, but what happens is when that colloidal silver, those particles are so small and they start to break down, your image fades really rapidly and it goes through a tonal change. So it starts to lose that purple color and it reverts back to this sort of orange-red color. And you can see here there are some lines on his head, and these were pencil retouching that the photographer did at the time that this was made, and it was toned and it was a really deep purple color, and they actually matched. But now that the photograph has faded, these retouchings look a lot more prominent. And then on the right we have the filamentary, the developing out silver. And you can see there's so much more silver in this image. So the whole background is made up of silver here. And what happens is it starts to deteriorate around the edge, and it forms that silver sulfide I talked about. So that silver sulfide we sometimes refer to as mirroring, and that happens because the environmental factors come from this edge in and they move inward. But you can see that there's a whole lot of silver. You're not losing necessarily the tone, you're just getting sort of a layer of silver sulfide on the surface, versus in this case you're losing the entire tonality. So now that we have a little bit of understanding of how these deteriorate, we'll talk a little bit about the handling and labeling so we can understand what we can do to help prevent further damage. So the one thing that is really important with photographs, because I mentioned a whole long list of things that deteriorate these things, and one of them is your own hands. So if you have generally kind of oily hands, or you don't wash your hands before you handle the photographs, then you can permanently put fingerprints and other marks that then, if your environment is fluctuating in temperature and humidity, will then expand and contract your photograph, and then stick your it'll embed your photographic imprint in there for life. So it's really important that you wear gloves when you're handling photographic materials. Now I recommend that there are two different types, that you can use the white cotton gloves or the nitrile gloves. I suggest the nitrile because there are a lot of people out there with latex allergies, so make sure you get all three sizes because not everybody's hands are the same size. So if I'm handling a object and I'm wearing a large size glove and my hand is generally a small, it actually becomes more cumbersome and dangerous to handle the photographs with the gloves on than it does for me to handle them without the gloves on. So do make sure you get all the sizes. And then here are the three types of gloves. So on the left are the nitrile gloves, and you can find these in scientific catalogs. You can find them at Home Depot. You can find them even, I think, at some drugstores have them. Just make sure that they're nitrile and not latex, and they might not always be blue. I've seen purple ones, or they come in various colors, so the color doesn't really matter. It's just the material. And then in the middle are the plain white cotton gloves. And then on the right are another style of white cotton gloves. And you can see in the detail I put here, there's these little plastic nubbies that are put on the fingertips, and they're supposed to help you grip materials. I tell you not to use these gloves because I've actually seen the imprint of those little nubbies go onto the photographic emulsion, and then there's little dots on the photographic emulsion that'll stay there. So those are actually harmful. You can use those gloves for anything else, just don't use them to handle photographs. And then the labeling part, so labeling, there are 3 different types of materials that you can use for labeling, and then the main one I suggest is a graphite pencil. So your normal pencil that you have at your desk is a number 2 lead pencil, and those are fine if that's all you have, but I prefer that you get a softer graphite lead pencil, like a 6B. You can get these at any art supply stores or at like Michael's Crafts or any place like that that sells art supplies. The lead in that is a little bit softer, so it helps especially if you have quite a heavy hand when you are pressing down to write, that you're not imprinting a mark onto the front of the photograph when you're writing on the back. Now this middle pencil is called a pure graphite Gretacolor monolith pencil, and these you can get in some of the archival supply catalogs, and you can also get these at the art supply stores, and these are 100% pure graphite. These pencils are good for writing on the back of resin-coated photographs. So if you don't know the difference between the two 20th century photographic papers, from I think into the 1960s, most papers are paper or fiber based, which means there's a paper coating on the back, and in the 60s they came out with these resin coated papers which are plastic on the back. So you'll find if you try to write on these with one of the pencils on the top, like a regular number 2 pencil or one of these 6B pencils, that it won't write on the back of this plastic. So the pure graphite is the one that you can use to write on the back of those plastic based photographs. You can use that pencil to write on the back of the paper-based photographs as well. So if you have to buy one pencil, I suggest maybe you just get the Gretacolor one. And then the black Sharpie at the bottom is not for labeling photographs, but for labeling the plastic sleeves that you put your photographs in. So don't ever write on the back or front of any photograph with a Sharpie or a pen. So again, where do you mark? So ideally it depends on your collection. So ideally you would want to mark the housing enclosure and not the photograph. However, if you have a collection that's accessed readily, or you have a lot of researchers that are going through boxes and boxes of photographs that are all in these very specific envelopes and they're taking them out, they might not put them back properly, so you don't want to get information lost in the handling and use of your objects. So in that case, I would say it's better to mark the housing. Better to mark the photograph. So if you have to, I would mark it on the very bottom. A lot of photographs have borders on them, so if you can mark in the border area on the back of the photograph, that's best. If you can put more of the information on the actual housing sleeve or envelope, and then put minimal information on the photograph, but something that can connect the photograph with the envelope, that's ideal too. You don't ever want to put adhesive labels, even if they're labeled as archival adhesive labels, on the backside of any of your photographs, because all of those adhesives will eventually fail, and then you'll have adhesive residue on the back of your photograph, and then the actual paper carrier that has all the information on it will eventually fall off and you will lose it. So it's very important that you actually either mark the housing enclosure or mark the photograph or mark them both. No post-it notes or adhesive labeling. So part 3 is talking a little bit about the proper storage materials, and I mentioned before in the beginning about all the deterioration that is caused by materials that you put in direct contact with photographs. So we really want to pay attention to what materials we use in storing our photographs. So the one main thing that you need to know about storage materials is there's something called the Photographic Activities Test, or the PAT for short. And the PAT is a test that any person who makes a material that will be used for storage or labeling or anything that would come in contact with a photographic material can pay to have their object or their material tested at an independent testing site. And what they do is at these sites, there's a little piece of paper that if it's a piece of folder stock, they'll use a piece of the actual material. If not, they'll use a inert paper that then, if it's like a pen they're trying to test, they will write on that. And then they put it in this little jig that you see here on the right. And so there's all these different filter papers in there and stain detector papers, and it all gets sandwiched together. So there's 3 different testing detectors in there, and then so 3 different samples of the product that they're testing, and all of those get put into an artificial aging oven, and they're incubated for a certain amount of time. And when they come out, if any of those detectors have stains on them or show some sort of deterioration to the original material that's being tested, then it fails the photographic activities test. And what that tells us is that that material will be harmful for silver, which is what makes up most photographic images. So when you look in your archival supply catalogs, you're going to see this little, there's variations of it, but you'll see this past the photographic activities text next to a lot of the materials that are sold specifically for photographs. But if you find something in these catalogs that maybe is more designed for paper storage or map storage, and you're curious about it because you think it'll fit your photographic material, you can always call them up and ask them if it's been PAT tested, and they should be able to tell you whether or not it has or has not. So a lot of people want to know about buffered versus non-buffered materials for photographs. And the current ISO standard states that buffered materials are fine for all photographic materials. In the 1990s, it was the standard was non-buffered only, but we've found that there's really no reason that the little bit of buffering causes any harm to photographs, with the exception of blueprints or cyanotypes, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a bit. So buffering, if you're curious on the pH scale, buffering just raises the pH a tiny bit. So pH 7 in the very middle of that scale, where it says distilled water, is pH neutral. So if you're adding a buffering agent, and usually that's something like calcium bicarbonate, magnesium bicarbonate, and it's usually put in the paper making process in the slurry before they even make the material into a paper. And so what that does is just raises the pH a tiny bit from 7 to 7.5 to about 9.5, depending how much of that material they put in there. And now a non-buffer paper doesn't mean that it's acidic, it just means that it's more pH neutral. So a non-buffer paper can have a pH anywhere from 6.5 to 7.5, which falls pretty squarely in that neutral range. You'll find when you are searching for buying these materials that non-buffered materials are actually going to cost more than buffered materials. And the reason for that is that most paper is buffered that's made. Even your office paper that is in your printer or envelopes that you use, all of these papers are generally buffered because people don't want their materials to yellow and become brittle. So it's a pretty standard making operation to add buffering agents to paper. So making a non-buffered paper requires that you have to wash out all of the paper making machine, and which is usually runs 24/7, and so stopping that process to clean out to like make sure there's no calcium carbonate or magnesium carbonate left in the slurry costs a lot more money to the paper manufacturers to make the non-buffered paper than the buffered paper. So that's why you'll see it's a little more. But again, it doesn't really matter which one you use for photographic materials, except for, as I mentioned before, cyanotypes and blueprints. And these two processes are pH sensitive. And while the ISO standard says that cyanotypes and blueprints are okay to put in buffered materials, they're fine in a dry environment, but should you have a flood or some sort of influx of humidity in your collection, sometimes that humidity can react with the buffer in the storage enclosure, and it can cause color reversion in the cyanotypes or blueprints. So if you have these in your collection, and you'll know because they're that bright cyan blue, please don't put these in buffered materials just in case, just to be safe. And just like going to the grocery store, you get your choice of paper or plastic. And a little bit about each of these. We'll talk about paper first. Paper is good because it's fine for every type of photographic material out there. And that includes negatives. So if you look through the catalogs and you're trying to find something to buy, paper materials are a good choice. They're less expensive, and they're opaque, so they block out light. But they must pass that photographic activities test, that PAT, because you're putting your photographs directly in these envelopes, and they come in direct contact with the silver. So again, I talked about the opacity of them, so that helps if you're you have your photographs in envelopes that are in a box that are on a shelf, so that's minimizing the light. I mentioned they're pretty inexpensive compared to plastic, and they also must not contain lignin and pass a PAT test. Where I say there is a downside of paper is if you have a collection that's readily accessed by people and they have to constantly pull the photographs in and out of the paper sleeves to access them, then that action of having to remove the photograph over and over again then can be potentially harmful to the photograph because it just involves a lot more handling. And that's where plastic has an advantage. So again, the plastics, there are 3 different types. So all of these plastics have to be inert, which means they're non-reactive. So there's polyester, and some trade names for that are Mylar or Melanex, and then polypropylene and polyethylene. But again, all of these plastics must pass the photographic activities test. I mean, polyester, polypropylene, and polyethylene are sort of generic plastic names that refer to the type of polymer that they are. So just for an example, you can get polyethylene sheeting at Home Depot if you're painting your house and you want to cover your furniture. But that polyethylene is not inert. It contains extra chemicals and materials in the processing of the plastic. It may contain plasticizers, and those can leach out if you have a lot of heat and humidity, and those plasticizers will stick to your photographic materials. So it's important, even more so important in the case of plastics, that the photographic activities test has been done on them and that it is passed. So just be careful with those. There's a lot of materials out there that are called polyester, polypropylene, or polyethylene that aren't good plastics. They're fine for most photographs, except for you never want to put acetate or nitrate negatives in plastic, because acetate and nitrate negatives are also plastics, and they're poor quality plastics. And if you've ever had any in your collection that have deteriorated, you know it. Especially acetate materials, they smell like vinegar. If you have that smell, it's the acetic acid coming out of the plastic. You know for sure that your acetate is deteriorating. If you have nitrate, it smells more like stinky cheese or feet is the smell. I don't know. I've smelled it and I don't know what it smells like. It's weird. But those materials both contain plasticizers, and those plasticizers leach out of the plastics as they age and they become very sticky. So if you have sticky acetate or nitrate film and you put it in a plastic sleeve, even if it's a good quality plastic sleeve, those plasticizers will fuse to the plastic of the sleeve, and they will become one plastic, and then you won't be able to separate them. So you don't ever want to put those two materials in the plastic, but everything else is fine unless for some reason you have a photograph that has a lot of hand retouching that's sort of flaky or powdery. There is a static charge that occurs between the two sheets of plastic, which is good for holding the photographs in, but maybe not good if you have hand applied media. It could pull the media off. And then the cost, this is probably the factor that influences most people. So the paper versus plastic dilemma. So this is just an example. Say you have about $20 to spend, and you can get about 100 buffered 4x5 paper sleeves for your photographs for about $20. Versus if you want to get a polypropylene album page that can hold up to about 75 prints, so you're getting a little less, you get 25 of those pages for about $20, just a little under $20, so you can see there's 25 less prints that you can store for the same amount of money if you're buying plastic. And then if you're buying individual polyester sleeves, those are obviously a lot more expensive. So you can only get about 10 of those for $14. So let's say you can get maybe about 12 or 13 of those for $20 versus 100 paper sleeves. So you can see there's a huge advantage financially in buying the paper versus the plastic. What happens when you have mixed media storage? And this happens in a lot of people's collections. The picture I have here on the left shows this is a collection from a university yearbook group. So, they have a photograph that's paper clipped to a sheet of paper that's probably not good quality. But that paper contains a lot of information about the photograph. It contains, when the photograph was taken, maybe who the people in the photograph are, who the photographer was. So we don't want to lose that information. So we want to be able to store the two materials together. So first of all, you can see there are paper clips on there. So those would be the first things to remove. Anything that kind of attachments that hold them together, you want to take them apart. And then what you want to do is you can place the photograph in a plastic sleeve so you can see what it is, and then you can place that photograph and that piece of paper that contains the information that is needed in a paper folder together or a plastic sleeve together. But the idea is you want to isolate the photograph from the paper because we don't know what, and it's likely it's not a good quality paper, but we can't ever be so sure, so it's better to be safe than sorry. So making sure that the photograph can live in a paper sleeve with that questionable paper, but it needs to be isolated. So this is the way to get around that. And then you want to make sure also that you label the photograph and the paper items together, so just in case they get separated and you don't want to, when you remove the paper clip, you're removing a physical attachment that they have, so you need to connect them in a way that makes sense. So labeling both with the same number is a good start for that. And then for boxes, so we have vertical and horizontal boxes, and I'm going to talk a little bit about vertical boxes first because they're my favorite. Vertical boxes are great because when you can see in that middle slide or the right one, when you open the lid, you can see everything that you have in the box, which is hugely beneficial for accessing your collection. So if your collection is used a lot, I highly recommend that you invest in vertical boxes because we'll go through the horizontal, the pros and cons of those, but you can see that you can easily pull out the photograph that you want from the upright box. But there are good ways and bad ways of storing materials in these vertical boxes. So the advantage that you can have easily an easy access to your collection in these boxes is great, except for if you have, you don't have enough materials to fill a box. So in this case, these materials are all different sizes, so we put them all in same size folders and then put them in this box. However, it doesn't quite fill out the box, so what you need to do is put a spacer in here. And what I've done is taken some alkaline blue board, which is, the good quality cardboard that you can buy at the archival supply, and I've just creased it and made a U shape here. And I realized from teaching a lot of workshops that not everybody is spatially minded as other people. So if the idea of cutting out that U shape in the blue board just makes you crazy, then you can do many other things. You can cut a board like this one here that just fits directly inside the box, measure the inside of the box and cut that. You can also take tissue that's passed the photographic activities test and just stuff tissue in there. But the idea is just to put something in there that allows these folders to stay upright and not to flop around in the box. Again, when you have materials, one size box but different size materials you're trying to put in there, you want to separate them with spacers. Even if you have things that are all the same size, it's a good idea to cut boards like this and put them intermittently in between the materials, just so there's some kind of rigid board. And the reason that we do that is because here on the right, this probably once was all photographs that were this shape, but because there's a lot of space and a lot of pressure from this end of the box to this end of the box, we got a lot of curling that happened. So there is a wrong way to store your materials in your vertical box, and had this person actually just put some spacers in this box, then we wouldn't have this problem. And this is a huge issue I just want to mention with photographic materials that happens. I'm sure you've all noticed that they all kind of want to curl at the ends, and that's like a pretty common phenomenon with photographic materials, and it's because the photograph is comprised of a piece of paper and a gelatin emulsion, and those two materials expand and contract differentially. So when it expands and then it tries to contract back to its normal shape, the gelatin is pulling really strongly and the paper wants to contract at a different rate, so that's what happens, and that causes the curl. So it's really imperative that you put those spacers in. So the horizontal box, as I mentioned, is the alternative to that. And the horizontal box can be very neat. You can get it in two different varieties. There are the regular, what we call metal edge boxes, which are made of paperboard that's good quality. And then we have these fancier cylinder boxes, which if you work at a museum, you might have these. That's usually where I find them. The cylinder boxes cost a lot more than the paperboard boxes, but they do the same function. They serve the same function. So these are great if, say, you have a collection where you have a lot of things in standard sizes, like you have one standard size window mat that's 16 by 20 and you're stacking a whole bunch of things that are all in 16 by 20 mats. this is where these kind of boxes make sense. If you have a bunch of materials that are not the same size, then it becomes a little bit tricky because you can, if you overstack the boxes with materials, then you can impress like the imprint of a smaller photograph that maybe is on a mount into a thinner photograph that might be sitting on top of it that's larger than it. So they can be slightly problematic, but they're fine. They're just not as accessible as horizontal or as vertical boxes. And you can see here there's two types of horizontal box. There's one that has a drop front and one that's like a normal rectangular box. So on the left here is the one that has the normal rectangle, and you can see it's this person is trying to pull these materials out, and they have to stick their hands on either side to grab the object, and you can see that they kind of press the box out a little. So they're stressing the box to get to the photographs. Versus the one that has this drop front is a lot easier because you can put one side down and then you can slide the materials out a lot easier than you can trying to do it on the other way. So if you buy these horizontal boxes, I highly recommend you spend a few little bit of money to get the ones with the drop front. And then interleaving tissues, if you're using these horizontal boxes, it's a good idea to not have these photographs sitting one on top of one another, because if you do have changes in your humidity, which let's be honest, we all do, the photographic emulsion can get sticky and you might have one photograph stick to another. So the way to get around that is to put an interleaving tissue in between each photograph. And then that also helps to protect the photographs when you're handling them, getting them in and out of the box. So there's two types of photographic interleaving tissues that have passed the PAT test, and that is microchamber paper that is made by Nielsen Bainbridge, and art care paper that's made by Conservation Resources. I don't think there are any others out there that I'm aware of that have passed the PAT, so you can get one of these, and they come in various weights, so you should be able to find one that suits your needs just using one of these two options. And then as far as suppliers go, this is a list of ones that I recommend that you use. I am not paid by any means by any of these companies. I can just tell you these are ones that I've had good experiences with, that I've used their products over the years, and they've been pretty good products. So, you know, there's a lot of other suppliers out there, other catalogs, but these ones tend to be ones that are up on whether or not materials have been tested. And also these suppliers are really good if you're doing a project where you have a pretty large project and you're going to order a very large amount of materials. You can call them up and they will do a large order for you and give you a discount. Because you'll see when you go through these catalogs that, you know, buying these materials, the price of these things adds up pretty fast. They are also very good with price matching. So if there's something you're, you know, say you really want in Gaylord, but you're making an order through Hollinger Metal Edge, you know, just call them up and say, hey, I'm ordering these horizontal boxes, and I see that they sell them at Gaylord and they're, you know, 50 cents less. Most of them will honor the price match, so it's good to communicate with them, and they all, from my experience, have very good customer service people that answer their phones, so don't be shy or bashful about telephoning them. So you can see here I've given you all of their websites, so Conservation Resources, Gaylord, Hollinger Metal Edge, Talus, and University Products are the ones I recommend most. So let's talk a little bit about the terminology that you'll see in the catalogs. So the two big terms that you'll see on almost every product description, or you'll see on products everywhere from the archival supply catalogs to, you know, your local CVS or Staples, are the words archival and acid-free. And these two materials, if you take away one thing from this webinar today, I want you to take away that these are not good descriptors for describing your materials. So the word archival, maybe 20 years ago when the whole sort of archival acid-free storage phenomenon wasn't such a ubiquitous thing, meant something. But today these words are pretty generic. So archival just means it's meant to be used for, archiving your materials. It doesn't tell you anything about the quality of the material. And actually a lot of things that are labeled archival can be poor quality. As that's the same with acid free. You can see here I have something that you can, product you can get at Staples or Office Max here. It's labeled as acid free. But all that really tells you is that it was pH neutral at the time it was produced, and it doesn't tell you whether in 3 or 10 years if it's still going to be acid free or pH neutral. So those two words don't really mean anything. They're sort of like saying, I don't know, fat free or organic. We don't really know what the source of these words are, so I would say if you are describing the types of materials that you want for storing your photographic collections, that you don't use either of these words because they don't really tell you much of anything. But what is important is making sure that you get a material that is either buffered or non-buffered. And I'll just reiterate again, buffered is fine for everything except for those cyanotypes and blueprints. So making sure that you are aware of the difference between those two materials and choosing wisely from the products that are available. Big one, make sure it's passed that photographic activities test, because if it hasn't, then it will react with the silver of your photographic materials, and then there's really no reason to rehouse your photographic collection if you're not going to do it in something that isn't going to react with the material itself. So, and then the other thing is making sure it doesn't contain lignin. And if it does contain lignin, I can tell you it definitely will not pass the photographic activities test. So those two kind of go hand in hand. But lignin is a material that comes from wood pulp, and you all have seen newsprint that has aged and become really yellow and brittle. And newsprint is a material that is made pretty much solely of lignin. So you can imagine what that would do to your photographic materials if you had it in direct contact with them. Although I will just point out as a side note that a lot of modern day papers are made from trees which contain lignin. But all of that lignin is removed in the paper making process, so before it ever becomes a sheet of paper, it is a big vat of slurry of different materials, and that's when they remove certain materials and where they add things like buffering agents or optical brightening agents. So you can have a paper that starts out as a wood pulp paper but has had all of the lignin bleached out of it, and that makes it lignin free. So it doesn't have to necessarily be a cotton rag paper, it just has to make sure that the final product that comes out on the paper mill is actually lignin free. So a little bit about the housing do and don'ts, just to reiterate. Again, when you're storing your collection, you just want to, make sure you've washed your hands and you're wearing gloves when you're handling these photographs, because let's face it, like, you don't want to cause any more damage than all those other things that you don't really have a whole lot of control over. Make sure that you're labeling them only on the back side with those soft pencils, never with a pen or a marker, not with an adhesive label. Make sure that all of your storage materials have passed that photographic activities test, so you know that you're not doing any harm. And then, make sure that there's a barrier layer between your photographs and whatever other materials you're storing those photographs. You don't have to necessarily isolate all of your photographs into one box. They can be stored with other materials, but they just can't come in direct contact with them. And then make sure that you only just don't just buy materials that say archival or acid free on them, because those don't necessarily tell you anything about the actual product itself. And then again, just to remind you, staples, paper clips, post-it notes, anything that'll rust, anything that will cause an adhesive to stick onto the photograph are a no-no. And then again, the pens and markers and colored pencils for labeling, these are not good choices. And these will all be in the handout that we will get to you, whether we can get it up here on the, oh, they are up there now. So they're up on the right. The Storing Your Photographic Collection handout will have all of these do's and don'ts in it. So you can look at that later, and it'll give you all the different products and tell you what's past the PAT. It'll give you all that information I just went over. So part 4, this is the critical part of the lecture. I want you to think about if the storing your collection is sort of the emergency room scenario of what we're doing here as a project. You are the sort of triage nurses. So when you have, let's say the patient is your photographic collection, you have the photographic collection come to you, you need to make sure that you can do all of these things. You can make sure that you put them in, you're handling them properly, and you're putting them in the right storage materials, and you're housing them in a good environment. And those are all things that may seem small or insignificant, but those things together will make a huge impact on your collection. And that means there'll be less of it coming to me, who's the sort of emergency room surgeon who's there when the disaster occurs. But even though you can do all of that effort and buy a bunch of materials and rehouse your collection, but what really makes a huge impact, or the most significant impact on the collection, is making sure that you have a good temperature and environment. And I'll put the caveat out there that this is probably the most difficult and challenging segment of storing your photographic materials, because it is the most costly by far. So it's not that rehousing does nothing. Rehousing actually does a lot of things. But you'll see in these coming slides that there's the overall longevity of the photographs is most impacted by the temperature and relative humidity. So as I mentioned, it's really beneficial, but in order to really expand the lifetime of your photographs, and keep in mind this is all sort of theoretical math, because photography is fairly new. It's only been around since 1839. We don't have a huge amount of physical, actual, experience with how these things age, just because we haven't had them that long. They're not as old as, old master paintings or whatever. But if you have a general ideal temperature in your storage area, so that's about 75 degrees Fahrenheit and 55% relative humidity, which is what we usually recommend for any paper-based materials, that'll be okay for your collection. But if you can put your photographic collection in its own little isolated area where you can keep the temperature at 65 degrees Fahrenheit, which is just 10 degrees less, it'll double the lifetime of your photographs. So that is pretty significant, although you don't want to have your entire archive at 65 degrees Fahrenheit, because that's not a good comfortable temperature for the human body. So the idea with this is that 65 degrees is what we refer to as a cool storage environment, and so you'd want to have that to be its own little room, and where you don't have to go in and out of there a lot to access materials, where materials can just live on their own. Again, any increment change between 75 and 65, if you can just lower your temperature down to 72, that helps as well. But you also have to take in consideration, like, do you work in a space where your desk is also in that archive storage? So you don't want to be in a space that makes you uncomfortable, because your longevity is more important than the photographs. So we want to make sure that you're comfortable, but also I'm just pointing out that this does make an impact. And also, relative humidity is really hard to control, even in the best storage, most expensive, well-designed storage spaces. Controlling the relative humidity is really hard because we don't have control over the outside temperature. So when the outside temperature changes and fluctuates, that plays an impact on what happens inside your building. Your building is not isolated uh, and regulated down to like one temperature. So making sure if you work in a space where you don't have control over the temperature and humidity, that you do have a good relationship with the people that do have control over your HVAC system. So for a lot of people that work in museums or universities or historical societies, that's often your facilities people. So you want to, make sure you communicate with them. It's good to regulate your environment with data loggers, so you can show them physical evidence of what's happening in your space. So just to give you a little bit of an idea, there's all different types of photographic materials. So I can show you, this is from Bertrand Lamborghini's book, A Guide to the Preventive Conservation of Photographic Collections, and this is a really great guide if you don't own this book. I believe it's published by the Getty. But you can see here there's a different range of environments, and these are all the ideal. So, you might not be able to keep your photographs in the ideal, but these are the ideal temperatures. So you can see a lot of them are like black and white on paper. That's any kind of silver gelatin photograph, probably anything you have from the 20th century. Black and white glass supports, so glass plate negatives, those were used pretty extensively in the 19th century. And color materials like Polaroid, Cibachrome, dye transfer, pigment processes, those all benefit greatly from the cool storage environment. So that's 65 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you can just lower the temperature down, that helps with the longevity of those materials versus like polyester film supports, which are more like 1960s and on. Film based materials are okay to pretty much be at room temperature versus the acetate and nitrate film support, which I talked about, deteriorate pretty rapidly. Those really need to be in cold storage. So those are 35 degrees to 45 degrees and even can be lower. Those deteriorate so fast, and once they deteriorate, the rate of deterioration is so rapid that you can't reverse any of that. So you don't ever want them to get to the point. So if they already smell like vinegar or stinky feet or cheese, then you know that you already have deterioration issues, and it's only going to go downhill quickly from there. So getting those materials into cold storage is probably more critical than, say, putting your black and white photographs into cool storage, because those are the ones that are at most risk. And that also is the same for color-based photography. So we've all seen old color photographs that have faded over the years, and the reason that those are so susceptible is because they were once made from silver gelatin photographs, but that silver has been bleached out and replaced with dyes. And dyes are just inherently soluble materials and are super sensitive to light. So again, once the dyes start to fade, there's no getting that back. So as a conservator, if you bring me a photograph that looks totally magenta, I cannot put the cyan and yellow layers back. There's really no options for treatment for you. So the only way to really save the color materials is to keep them in cold storage. And that also goes for color-based film materials. So you can see there's a huge difference between film-based and color versus your regular standard silver gelatin photographs from the 19th and 20th century. But again, people get really hung up on this. Cold storage it's great if you can do it right. There are plenty of ways that you can do it. You don't have to have a walk-in facility. There are various ways of doing it. You can have upright freezers that you can modify, that you can put into your storage space. You can have little walk-in cold storage rooms built within your storage space, or you can have a whole dedicated cold storage space, which is, I will be honest, vastly expensive. But cold storage is sort of kind of a whole other webinar within itself. So I just want to make sure that you have access to this. So the National Park Service, they have this fantastic website on cold storage, and they tell you how to store your materials in an upright freezer. They tell you all about how to package it and how to put it in the freezer and how to retrieve it from the freezer. Because one of the things about cold storage that's kind of hard to grasp is that, yes, it's ideal to put all of these very sensitive materials into cold storage, but that means they have to live in there. Because every time you open up the freezer and you retrieve the box, you have to acclimate it. So you've all, like, I don't know if any of you wear glasses, I do, and you go outside in the wintertime and then you go from the hot to the cold and your glasses fog up and you get that condensation on them. It's the same principle with the cold storage. So you take something that's in a really cold environment and then you put it in a warm environment like room temperature, it's going to start to sweat. So what happens is you get all this condensation that forms on the packaging, and then that becomes very damp, and then that becomes super dangerous for the photographic materials that you just pulled out of the freezer. So there's a whole wrapping system that involves multiple layers of plastic, and then also an acclimation time frame where you move it from one super cold environment to, say in like sort of most DIY low budget method, like putting it in a cooler, maybe with a little bit of ice, so it goes, from one environment to another very slowly versus going from a freezing cold space to a room temperature space where you're going to get that risk for the humidity damage. So this is all all very well described in video format and in written literature on this website. So if you are interested in it, then you might want to, do a little more investigation on this website. But the point is that they really need to be stored for good. So if you have a bunch of color material, a bunch of color photographs that people look at all the time in your collection, then cold storage is really not for you. Unless this final slide in this section here is you digitize all of that material first. So digitization is really great because most researchers don't really need to see the actual physical object. People are generally happy to see just the image on a screen. So unless you have someone who's doing some very specific research on an artist or a photographer that they need to actually see the object, for the most case, people are just more interested in seeing the images. So this is where digitization comes into play as a useful tool. So a lot of people ask me about when you're digitizing materials, if the light from the flatbed scanner is harmful for the photograph. And yeah, I did mention before that light is damaging to the photograph, but the light that it receives from the flatbed scanner is not that significant. The same thing with photocopying, unless you have, this one photograph of like Abraham Lincoln, and then somebody is, every researcher that comes in wants to photocopy it or scan it, then yes, of course, the accumulation of all of that light exposure is going to be harmful. But just scanning it once is okay, even for things that are sensitive like color dye photographs. It's only going to get a tiny bit of exposure to light. But if you do have something that you think is really sensitive, then the alternative is to put it on a copy stand. So you can see on the right there are two lights, and they're on at full blast in this picture, but you can have it where those lights are off and they only flash for a second while it takes the photograph. So that's another alternative, and also that is a good use for digitization of materials that maybe are too fragile or have a thickness or If you have something like glass plate negatives and it's broken, it's better to do that on a copy stand than it is to put it on a flatbed scanner. So those are just two options for digitization. And so if you do think about cold storage as an option, you really want to digitize all of those materials because the idea is really to keep them in the cold storage for life. So unless you have to pull them out, and you can, but you shouldn't be going in there, every month or something pulling out boxes because it's really hard on the photographs to go through all that acclimation from the temperature from cold to hot and then from hot to cold. And also it's a huge problem with you might as well not even go through the whole cold storage if you're going to be pulling things out all the time. But cold storage is also requires a lot of attention from your staff. People have to monitor the freezers and make sure they're operating properly. So it is a huge investment, not only financially, but also in time and education. So it's not for everybody. So I like to be very practical when I teach, and I like to tell people that, you can start at the bottom. So start with the rehousing. So that's already making an impact. So you've taken something that is in an environment that's going to be damaging for it, and then you've changed that environment. So now, before maybe you had your photographs stacked together and they were just thrown in a box, but now they're interleaved with tissue or they're each put into a sleeve. That little bit of impact that you make actually does make a huge change. So you don't have to go all the way to the cold storage if you don't have the money. And let's be honest, I've worked with a lot of people in a lot of various types of collections, and most people don't have cold storage. It would be nice if everybody did, but it is very costly. So you can only do what you can, but each little step actually does help for the longevity of your photographs. So these are just you can find these at the Smithsonian's Archives website. These are just some sort of standardized digitization recommendations. So because a lot of people ask me about this. I'm not a digitization expert, I'll be honest. I work with the actual photographs and not with the scans. So these are, the sort of settings that they suggest that you use in order to make sure you get a good scan that's useful and archival. And then also just making sure of minor things. If you're going to do a big digitization project, you might want to check with whoever is your IT provider at work, because making all of these scans and storing all these large, like these minimum values of 600 ppi, which is pretty big, is going to make huge files. So you want to make sure that you have enough space on your server to accommodate all of these files, and that you're not clogging up your employer's server with your digitization project. So that's something that you need to consider if you're going to do a big project like that. You might have to invest some money financially into expanding your server. Also, you want to make sure that they're backed up somewhere else, preferably off-site. There's a lot of cloud sharing now in places that you can buy space in the cloud to store and back up your materials, but if you think about if you're going to spend all this money to digitize your collection, you want to make sure that if for some awful reason you had a flood or a fire and that got damaged, that you didn't lose, or your computer just dies. You want to make sure that those are all backed up somewhere. So redundancy is really good in this situation. And then just before I allow you to open up for all of your questions, I just want to point out too that if you do need a conservator, I mean, a lot of these things you can do on your own. I feel like you are very well equipped to, with a little bit of education, to handle and label and store your photographs. But should you need a conservator for questions, we at the Conservation Center work on paper-based materials, and we do work for even across the globe for our clients. They're not all just based here in Philadelphia, so we do work with a lot of different collections all over the place. And if you need, if you have something that's maybe too fragile to send, or you need a conservator in your area, the American Institute for Conservation is our professional organization, and they have a Find a Conservator link on their website. So you can type in your zip code and what sort of, say you're looking for a paintings conservator, you can put that in there as an option and it'll tell you who's in your area. I will tell you, photograph conservation is pretty tiny in the US. Well, it's pretty tiny in the whole world. I think there's definitely less than 200 of us globally. So finding a photo conservator might be more tricky than finding a paintings conservator or an objects conservator. So I just want to point that out to you. So I think that's sometimes why we have a lot of clients outside of the Philadelphia area, because there's not a lot of people actually working on photographic materials. But there are some people scattered. The East Coast and West Coast are more populated. The Midwest is a little more barren of conservators in general. So, you may have just be prepared that you may have to work with somebody who's not in your region. But it's good to look through the AIC's website and see who is in your area. So with that, I'll just open it up. I'm happy to answer any questions you have. Okay, so the first question I have here is, have you ordered from Light Impressions? If so, what is your view on the quality of their products? It's interesting that somebody asked this. I used to have Light Impressions on my list of recommended vendors. I don't have any issues with the quality of their products. I think as a business they're not doing well, and I think from my experience and the experience of some of the clients that I've worked with, that there has been a lot of back ordering from Light Impressions. So sometimes that really can bottleneck a project. So that's why I excluded them from the list. But they do have good quality products. They used to be one of the 4 leading archival suppliers. I don't really have a problem with them other than their stock seems to be not as full as the others. The next question is Avery not a good brand then? Boy, I feel like these are hard questions. I feel like I have to say a lot of bad things about brands. Avery is a fine brand if you want to, use them for office supplies, but they're not a recommended brand for storing your collections. No, none of those materials have been vetted, and none of them have been tested with the PAT. So, like I said, there's a lot of things you'll find at Staples, Office Max, the craft stores that are, labeled as quote archival or acid free, but that it doesn't mean that they're safe to use for storing your collections. The next question is, are there any resources for those interested in becoming a photograph conservator? Sure. I'll tell you that there are only 3 graduate programs where you can become a photograph conservator in the United States. The Buffalo State College in Buffalo, New York, that's where I received my master's degree, is one program. There is a program at the University of Delaware at Winterthur, and there is a program at NYU. And those programs only take 10 students per year or less, and the requirements to get into those master's degrees programs are generally you have to have an undergraduate degree, preferably in art history and or fine arts, or both. You have to have chemistry up to organic 2. Um, they generally ask that you have a foreign language, and then the big thing is that you have to have so many sort of what we call pre-program or volunteer before you become a conservator hours working as a technician, sort of studying with a conservator to get into the program. So you can see that even with them, the competition is probably pretty fierce to get into school now, like even more so than when I went. And also, there's only 30 of us graduating really a year in the United States. So um, it's not a lot of people getting into the field, and there's, obviously not a lot of jobs either to match the number, even that small number of people. So, but there are different avenues you can take to be a conservator. Um, you can work at a museum, you can work at a regional center like I do, you can work in private practice. So there are options for employment. But if you're interested in it, I would highly recommend that you go to one of the graduate school websites, and they'll tell you all of the education requirements that you need to get into one of the programs and what you need to do to apply. I think that's the best way to start. And I think there might even be something on the AIC's website about that, or there's definitely a link where you can get to all the school programs from there. The next question is, we have large oversized collection of panoramic photos. What do you recommend for their storage? We don't have a lot of space, but we want to make sure they are stored properly for longevity. This is a great question and one that I get asked quite a bit. So I'm going to maybe ask if you can respond to Diani so she can tell me, but if your panoramas are rolled or if they're open, but I can kind of go over both scenarios. If they're already rolled tightly into sort of tubes, I highly recommend that you don't try to open them up, because when you open them up, they go from something that's, maybe, I don't know, rolled 8 inches by 3 inches to something that then might be 72 inches long. And okay, the answer was that they are still flattened frames. So if they're already if they're already opened, then you probably don't want to roll them, and it's probably best to still leave them in their frames. If they're framed like that, you can take that archival blue board and you can cut and stack them. If they're framed in glass, it's not really good to stack them horizontally, so it's better to sort of lean them against a wall or make a box that they fit in, and then put something that's in between them so the glass isn't hitting against one another. So it can be the archival blue board, it can be coroplast. Since they're already contained in frames, then it can even be some kind of ethafoam or something that you have, because that's not going to be in direct contact with your photographs. But if you do have ones in your collection that are already rolled up, everybody always wants me to humidify and flatten those, and then it does create a space issue because they tend to be super long once they're unrolled. So if you have them still rolled, those upright vertical boxes are great for that. You can stick 2 or 3 of those in an upright box. Generally, the one advantage that panoramas have that works in their favor is they're usually only 8 to 10 inches high, so they fit very nicely in those boxes. So you can just have them stood up in the boxes. But if you already have them and they're flat, I mean, even if you unframe them, you still have the issue of their length. So I don't really recommend taking them out of the frames and rolling them, just because then if you do want to display them at some point or someone wants to look at them, then you have this rolled panorama. So yeah, unfortunately there's not like a super good answer for you as far as other than like putting them, in like a box or stacking them in a way that if you can make a box that has pretty rigid boards so they can be stacked horizontally, that's also an option, but they do unfortunately just take up a lot of space. So the next question is, what photographic collection item materials should we avoid placing in exhibits? What support materials and lighting equipment would you recommend to keep materials safe while they're on display? So the first part of the question, like the temperature, humidity, storage environment, each photograph has its own level of sensitivity to light. So there are some materials that are more stable and some materials that are super sensitive to light. Again, this is another, if you really want some resources, that Bertrand Lavadrine book or Jim Riley's Care and Identification of 20th Century Photographs is also a really good resource for this. I can just tell you in general, it's like black and white silver gelatin print is more stable than any of those 19th century materials I talked about that are made with the colloidal silver with those little tiny particles. But then within those 19th century materials, things like salted paper prints are, way more unstable than, a cabinet card from the late 19th century. Color materials are super sensitive to light. So if we're talking about 20th century materials, then the color materials are much more sensitive than the black and white materials. And so you really have to do a lot more reading up on that. But in general, when you're having a photograph on exhibit, the light level should be really low. It should be for at most 10-foot candles, but for a lot of those materials, it can sometimes be down to 3 or 5-foot candles of light. And again, if you look in some of those resources in the bibliography, you'll see which ones require less light and which ones can have a little more. So in general, it's the more stable the image is, the more light, but 10-foot candles is not a whole lot. So if you've seen photographs on display in a museum, you probably noticed that the room is pretty dim, and that's because we want to minimize the light. And then also you want to minimize the display time that they're exposed to the light, because the light is cumulative damage, so you don't want to have it on display for 6 or 8 months. So usually photo exhibits are only a couple months long, and then especially if they're traveling to multiple places. And then we recommend what we call like a rest period where they stay in the dark for a number of years, and they can't be displayed again. The rest period doesn't refresh any light damage that it's received from exhibition. Just know that anytime, no matter what photograph you put on the wall, including your family pictures, all of those materials are deteriorating from light. Even if you just have the 3-foot candles, that continuous light exposure does do harm to the photographs. So it's sort of a trade-off, because we can't just hide all the world's photographs and never show them or exhibit them, or we can't, we don't want to have a place where we never can put our family photographs on the wall. You just have to know that this causes damage, and it's a trade-off of our allowing people to see these things versus knowing that there's a small amount of damage that's just naturally going to occur, and you do all the things you can to minimize that, like lowering those lights down. Sometimes it can just be having the automatic lights, the lights come on with a sensor when people come in the gallery space, putting UV coated plexiglass or glass on the frames that they're in. So there's a lot of things you can do to make that exposure as minimal as possible, and then that, like I said, putting them back into cold storage and not lending them or letting people put them on display for a number of years is critical to, to their lifespan. Um, and then also just making sure when you're exhibiting photographs that, there's a lot of like trend with contemporary photography to just sort of hang things on the wall, not framed. So, you have to keep in mind that, things can get spilled on these photographs. These surfaces are really susceptible to scratching and abrasion. So, if someone's talking at the art opening and they've got a little metal buckle on their purse and they don't realize they're close, like anything that rubs up against it can scratch. So it's really critical, in my opinion, to have things that are protected. So if you have any other questions beyond that, I'm happy to answer, but I'm just going to move on to the next one, which is I have a large number of framed photographs, some of which may have been taken some water damage. Is it better to leave them in their individual frames? That is a very tricky question too. So what happens with photographs that have become wet that are framed? Will point out that most people don't frame photographs properly, which I mean I'm guilty of too, where we just stick the photograph directly in the frame with the emulsion side right up against the glass. So when you have moisture that seeps in, as I mentioned, that gelatin expands and contracts when it gets wet, and when it does, it becomes tacky. And when it gets to that tacky point, it can fuse to the glass, and that happens quite a bit. So if your photographs are not stuck to the glass, and you can usually tell because you'll see there'll be a difference in sheen when you look at the photograph through the glass, where you can tell where it's stuck. It might have a different glossiness to it. If they're not stuck, it's probably better to take them out of those frames because those frames are just sort of creating a kind of mold environment that the photographs are then just stewing in them. And if you can get like a clothesline or something, you might want to hang the photographs up to dry. Just, clip them at the very end. Those little bulldog clips that you can get from the office supply stores are great. So you want to make sure that you dry them out. But also keep in mind, if you have something you think has water damage, it probably has mold. So you want to do that in isolated space, preferably outside if you have, you obviously can't leave things outside forever. I don't know what your employment situation is, but if you're doing this, sometimes we've been able to do things on, like if we had roof access to places or if we had an enclosed yard, but you want to make sure that your objects are safe, but you really want to do this away from the rest of your collection because if those materials have mold, you can spread those mold spores throughout the rest of your collection, so you don't want to put that at risk. So that might be a case where you might need a conservator to look at your materials before you go unwrapping them from their frames. Um, so I just want to give everybody my email, which I think, was it on my... Okay, I'm going to go back here just so you have it again. I am willing to take any more questions that you have via email. I think we have to wrap it up pretty soon. Come back to the beginning of the presentation so you can have it. So it's rwetzel@ccaha.org, so if you want to take a moment to write that down. But please feel free to, go through the handouts and, just familiarize yourself with all of those different parameters for buying the materials, and there's all of those references, book references I've mentioned are in that bibliography, so you can get a lot of information even just from the Jim Riley, and Bertrand Laverdrine's books. Those are both super great resources for this topic. So I thank you for your participation today, and like I said, if you have any other questions, don't hesitate to email me.